Good
Cool.
afternoon, and welcome to another virtual author program at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and I'm delighted to have with us back again New York Times bestselling author Karen Rose. Before we begin, I do have a brief commercial message. We do have a limited number of signed copies of Karen's latest book, Say Goodbye. So if you'd like a signed copy from Karen herself, please go ahead and either give us a call at the bookstore or go online. We would be happy to hold one for you to pick up or put one in the mail. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Karen Rose.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, my first question for you is, a lot of readers are always fascinated by authors, the people they were before they started writing. Now, I know you have kind of an interesting background, including a couple of intriguing patents. Can you tell us a little bit about who Karen was before you became a writer?
Well, I have a degree in chemical engineering, which I've never truly used in the truly scientific. I've used it probably more writing my books than I did when I was an actual engineer, but I was a product development engineer. And those patents, I worked for a big consumer products company. And those patents were when I worked on bulk fiber laxatives. And we had changed it was Metamucil. We changed the formulation and made it a lot finer, easier to stir, easier to drink, because before it was like drinking sand. Honestly. And so my part of the project was to show that by grinding it smaller, the psyllium, which is the husk smaller, it did not impact the efficacy of the product. And I don't you want to know any more than that, but I know a lot more about laxatives than I have any right to know.
So you worked in that field. I think you taught chemistry.
I did, because I went from there and I had another job in between. And then I became a high school teacher and I taught chemistry, physics, math. I did teach creative writing. It was a small school. So we all wore, as many hats as you were certified to wear, just subjects to teach, you did. And I found that teaching creative writing is a lot more difficult than actually doing it. So I have a lot of respect for creative writing teachers, because I'm just like, I don't know, I just do it. So, but yeah, I was an engineer before. And that's actually when I started writing, was because I was traveling internationally. And I couldn't take enough books in my luggage and, for the trip and still have room for clothes. And there was there were priorities, and there were no ebooks back then. So when I would get to where I was going and read all my books, I didn't have anything to do because I couldn't understand the TV because it was all in another language. And so I started writing my own stories. That's how I got started writing.
And your first book was Don't Tell, which was published in 2003.
Correct.
Now, apparently you did have to work on rewriting that a couple times. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I started writing, again, it was just for fun. And by the time I kind of figured out that I really wanted to write an actual book, that somebody might want to read, I was into the whole idea for Don't Tell. And I wrote that book 5 different times. Like completely from scratch, 5 different times. And it was more of the way it was kind of self-teaching. I wasn't part of any kind of writing organization back then. I didn't really know anything other than to sit down and write a book. And then I would read it and, I would go back and change something. And through it started out more as women fiction. By the time I got it to the point where I sold it, it was romantic suspense. So there were a lot of iterations in there. And it took me a couple years to write all of those. And when I finally sold it, I was like, oh, this is what it feels like to actually have a book come together. And that was that. I remember where I was the day because I kept trying to figure out what was missing. And I had gone skiing, which I have not done in years. When I went skiing, I was in Colorado and I got stuck on a ski lift. And you're just kind of there dangling in the wind, your feet. And I was so quiet. And it was one of the first times it had ever been so quiet. And I had nothing to do but think. And the idea hit me in the head. And I got done with that trip and I finished the book and sold it.
That's great. I want to stop and mention that we have another reason to congratulate you besides your best-selling books. Your latest book, Say Goodbye, is your 25th book. It's your silver anniversary as a writer. That's an achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you. And the hero of this 25th book is the son of the heroine in the first book. And I didn't plan it that way. It kind of that's just the way the books landed. But it's a very poetic in its own way.
That's very serendipitous or something.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your latest book, Say Goodbye. It's the third in your Sacramento series.
Yes.
Can you tell readers about this series, about your new book that we'll look at?
Well, it starts out, and I have them all here. It starts out with Say You're Sorry. And in Say You're Sorry, the villain is actually a serial killer who keeps the jewelry of the women that he's killed and wears it in some form or fashion until he kills his next victim. And so the victim before the heroine in this book had a locket. And when he tries to attack the heroine in this book, she fights him off. She grabs a locket and yanks it. The chain breaks. And once she gets away, she's got this locket in her hands. So the book is about the serial killer, but the locket connects her to the hero who has escaped from a cult to which this locket is kind of their symbol. And the locket came from a victim who had escaped a cult only to then fall into the hands of a killer. So she kind of escaped the frying pan directly into the fire. That poor woman did. But so that's when you first meet the cult of Eden. You learn more about it in the second book, which is Say No More. And Say No More is Mercy's story, and Mercy is Gideon's sister. They both escaped through great sacrifices that their mother has made. And in the prologue for Say No More, Mercy's mother is actually killed helping her escape. And so she's got all kinds of guilt, and, poor Mercy, she's been through a lot. But you learn about how the cult started and who the bad guys are. And you learn in this book, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but you learn in this book that the bad guys actually started the cult because they were on the run from the law. They'd broken laws and they just needed to hide out for a while. And they brought some people with them, and this cult kind of just started. And they've been riding the high of this for 30 years and have amassed an amazing amount of money over that time, because each person who joins sells all their assets and creates his big bank account, which brings us to book 3. And book 3 is the fight for that money. And it's the two bad guys that are left out of the original ones. There's DJ, who's a younger man, he's in his 30s, and Pastor, who is in his early 70s, and he's the leader of the cult. And he's the one who keeps the purse strings for all of the money. And he's the one who controls it. And DJ wants the money. And Tom Hunter is the FBI agent who's going to take them all down. And he has become friends with Gideon and Mercy from the earlier 2 books. So you first meet Tom again in Say You're Sorry. He's been in 9 books. This will be Tom's 9th book when he finally gets his own book. But this Say Goodbye is the story of Tom and Liza, who worked together with the characters from the previous to take down the cult once and for all.
Now, if I remember correctly, the cult Eden, you kind of drew some inspiration from a real life experience when you were creating.
Yes. And it's quite a long story, but I'll make it very short. When I was in my early 20s, I was 2021, my husband and I were part of a church that was a normal church. I mean, it wasn't a cult. However, we found out after, and my husband and his brother were the ones that found this out, that our minister was not who he said he was, who he appeared to be. He was a fraud who lied about his entire education. He'd said he had a PhD from Harvard. He didn't. He said he was ordained. He wasn't. He had actually embezzled tens of thousands of dollars over 10 years from the church. And there were, sexual escapades and all kinds of other things going on that were just really, the story got more and more horrific as the days passed. Well, one would think that the congregation would say, oh my goodness, he's a bad person. He's lied, he's stolen from us. He needs to go. But what happened was, in the inspiration for the book, was the reactions of the parishioners. A third of us said he has to go. A third said, but he said he was sorry. He's really a nice man and he's a good speaker. We should keep him. And then the other remaining third said, y'all are crazy. We're leaving. And they all left, leaving the remaining 2 factions, as it was, to fight it out. And it got ugly. I mean, 20-year-old friendships broke, families broke apart. There were death threats. My husband and his brother got death threats. Somebody tried to run my brother-in-law over in a grocery store parking lot, and it just got nasty and ugly. And I remember being 20 years old and shell-shocked by all of it. And hurt and cynical and all of those other things. But I remember thinking, why are they so blindly following this man who, the data, the facts say that he's done a bad thing, and yeah, they will agree that he did a bad thing, but they're willing to continue following him. And it was that blind devotion that gave me the idea for writing this story. So, like, what would have happened had this, had they all those people picked up and moved? They would have been vulnerable, very vulnerable to a person like Pastor in this book. He was really not in it because he's a true believer. He's in it for himself.
Yeah. When you're researching a series like this, do you talk to, how do you go about getting those details that you incorporate? Do you read books? Do you talk to experts? Do you go online? Do you take classes?
I've never really taken a class, but I've done all the others. I'll talk to in Say Goodbye, for example. He's a computer expert, Tom is, and I have a relative who's very, very good at that. So he led me through, how would he go about doing some of these things. I have a friend who is fluent in Russian. And so she helped me with some of the Russian aspects of this whole series, because the Sokolov family, who's like the core family in the series, are Russian. But she knew a woman who had been an army medic. So she gave me a lot of the background I could use for Liza's character. And so, and then a lot, if I get stuck, I'll go online and see what's there. If not, I continue to dig and find a person. I always hate to bother the real people. I'm writing a book and you guys are doing something important like saving lives. But yeah, if I can't get it, I'll find somebody who knows it, or I'll find somebody who knows somebody, and and I keep digging until I get the answer I need.
You've said that you write about damaged people because they are much more interesting than regular people. Can you elaborate on this?
That's probably going to come back to bite me one of these days. I think that the backstory that they have is very interesting. And the fact that they are damaged and they're fighting so hard for their happily ever after, I think makes the reader want them to have that happily ever after even more, knowing where they've come from, how far they've fought, how far they've come, and what they're willing to sacrifice. I think makes it makes it feel like they've earned that happily ever after, or that good ending, more than if they didn't have to work quite so hard for it. But I may be a little bit too rough on my characters sometimes. I do regret that sometimes.
Well, what I like is you also, in many of your books, show a different side to villains, because all too often they're one-dimensional, but in their mind, they're the hero of their own story.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of your approach to crafting the anti-hero?
Yeah, the villains to me are the most important character in the book, because if they're not there doing all of their bad things, there's going to be no reason for the other characters to be there, or at least not be there in the capacity that they are. In my book world, they'll continue to exist, but they just don't exist together, and they don't exist fighting this bad guy. And so, having your villain have something either relatable, a quirk that's relatable, an obsession that might be relatable, a backstory that may be sympathetic on its face. I can understand how they got here. That doesn't make what they're doing now any more forgivable, but I can have some sympathy for the child they were, but not the adult that they've become doing all these horrible things. So it does tend to give the villain a few more layers. In Say You're Sorry, the first book in this series, the villain, at one point he steals a car. He kills a person, he steals a car, and then he realized there's a child in the back seat of the car. And I was pretty shocked, because I didn't plan that. I mean, I'm just riding along and all of a sudden there's a child in the back of the car. And I thought, what's he going to do about this? How's he going to handle this? And because he had been pretty much abandoned as a child, he could not, and he knew this. He had this conversation with himself. I can't leave this baby alone. It's cold. It's in the mountains in California. She would freeze to death. I can't leave her here. Somebody bad might find her. Well, you're bad, but I'm not that bad, you know? So that was the line in his mind. He couldn't cross. He couldn't let harm come to this child. So in the end, it's not the child that gets him caught, but the care he has to take. And every time he steals another car to keep moving on, he takes this child with him because he doesn't know what else to do with her. Yeah. Until the end, where he actually takes some physical risk, and and making sure that the child gets picked up and and dealt with, by someone who will take care of her. This character also likes dogs. The dog became a critical component of the book, and in Say Goodbye, none of them really have any loyalty towards anyone else, but it's DJ. If you look, DJ was abused as a child, and it's that will give him a little bit of sympathy, for the child he was and the way he was raised. It doesn't erase any of the harm and the devastation he's caused along the way, but that again enters very vividly into his plot.
Now, your books can be dark and they can be intense, and they're definitely things that keep the reader on the edge of their seat. What I read somewhere was that you approach incorporating violence in your stories from a film noir perspective. Yeah. How exactly does that play out?
And I have learned, I've learned over 25 books where to stop. I wrote one, in my very first book, there's a scene where the bad guy is trying to get a woman to tell him information. And he's taken her child out of the back of her car and holding the child over a bridge, like he's going to drop a kid into a river. So she'll tell him what he wants to know. And he says to her, if you tell me, I won't hurt your child. And so she tells him, and she goes, now I can go, right? He goes, I said I wasn't going to hurt your child. And when I first wrote the scene, he proceeds to kill her and then dump her over the side of the bridge, into the river. And my editor was like, don't go that far. If you just stop it where he says, I said I wouldn't kill the child. And then you go on, and then later they find her, what happens, but you don't have to show everything on the page. And I really learned from that and the whole film noir, because you don't see blood. You don't see a lot of bullets. I mean, somebody gets shot, but the key thing that those directors will use is the expressions on the faces of the bystanders, or the person who finds the body, or a witness. It's that horror and that shock that really is the message to the viewer. And so I learned from that. I mean, sometimes less is more. If you stop at a certain point, rather than going into the gore and everything, I personally don't like to read it. I know what happens. I'm writing the book. I know what happens, but it doesn't even feel good for me to type that out. So much less to read it. So I try to stay away from the gore. It's dark and you know what's going to happen, but I don't necessarily have to say every step of that.
When you've written books that are standalone, books that are connected through some means like a setting or a character, and your latest does have that connection, do you always know, like, for example, for the Eden books, how each book is going to be played out? Do you have like a arc for each book? Does it evolve organically? How did this particular trilogy come about?
Well, the first time I wrote a trilogy, I hadn't intended on it. And I wrote the first book and I got to the end and there was a cliffhanger and I had to write 2 more books to figure it out. And when I got to the third book, I had all these little items that I had left along the way that had to be threaded together. And it was a mess. And I thought, I am never doing this again. So if I ever do a series, I'm going to sit down and plan it all out ahead of time. So in that sense, I do. I mean, I knew that this would be 3 books. I knew who the characters were going to be in each book. And I knew, like, kind of the overview I gave. This is where you're introduced to the cult. This is where you learn more about it and how it got started and who the main bad guys are. And this is when it goes down. The details of each one, they just evolved as I went along. How I got to the end of each part of the story was what evolved. I mean, I knew how each book would end.
Readers are always fascinated by a writer's particular process when they're writing novels. Do you have a specific process? Does it vary from book to book? And my own personal question for you is, I understand you learned how to write suspense based on Law and Order episodes.
Part of it, yeah. When I first started writing, like I said, that book I wrote 5 times started out as women fiction. It didn't turn into suspense until I signed with my first agent, who said, "You have a very suspenseful voice. Have you ever considered writing suspense?" And I was like, I don't know, I never tried it. And being an engineer, I went about it in a couple of ways. I looked at things that held my interest, that whole Law and Order thing. And what I read when I did more research is that a normal 1-hour TV drama will have like 30 scenes. Law and Order has 42 average scenes. They're short. And if you watch, how they do things, they rarely are getting out of a car or driving anywhere. They're, the scene opens and they're in the living room telling the family that somebody's dead. They just kind of get dropped into the middle of every scene. So everything's sped up a little bit and compressed so that they can fit 42 scenes in 1 hour. So I learned that. But what I also decided to do was go back and look at a writer who had surprised me, because I like to be the reader or the viewer that's like, I can name that killer in 2 pages or 2 scenes. And I went back and I picked a book that had shocked me at the end, like it almost like a Sixth Sense kind of, but it couldn't have been him. And I went back and I didn't read it backwards, like word for word. I read it backwards, chapter by chapter, looking for how this author planted the clues. And what I found out was that the clues were all there, and they were all there in plain sight, but I cared so much about the characters that I forgot to look. And that was the big aha for me for writing suspense was, make it all about the characters. And when people care about the characters, they're going to be so invested in their safety and their safe return from this journey that they're not going to be watching for all the clues, and they'll be surprised by those as well.
That's great. Now, many authors have things that help them in the creative process, like music. I understand music does play a role in your writing process, and there's one particular musician that I was surprised to find is a favorite.
But Barry Manilow?
Yes.
Yeah, Barry is a favorite of mine, and I've seen him in concert 3 times now, and he's an amazing performer. I mean, he's like in his 70s now, and he continues to be an amazing performer. But there's something about, especially if I've heard the song a number of times, I'll take it and I'll put it on like in an infinite loop, and it becomes background music for me. When I wrote Say Goodbye, it was the Rainbow Connection by Kermit the Frog on infinite loop. And my daughter was really angry. I'm never going to be able to listen to Kermit the Frog that way again without thinking of murder. It's been, there was one that was Pink Floyd. There was one that was Josh Groban. I've used his soundtrack a lot, and it depends on the mood I want, but generally I'll just pick, right now I think it's, have you ever seen The Rain by CCR? That's the one that I'm playing right now. I'll just pick a song. If it's in my head anyway, I'll just pick it and I'll play it. And then when I start the music, then my brain is ready to think and it's time to write. So yeah, and I think there's also an element of playing something happy on the outside of my brain while my brain is looking at something dark. I think it softens the blow for me a little bit too, I think.
Based on your long career as a writer, what do you know now that you wish you had known when you were first starting out?
It doesn't get easier. Different things get harder, I think. And every time I start a book, I'm always in a panic, and I always think, why did I ever think I could do this for a living? Why did I think that I could write an FBI agent? I've never been an FBI agent, and then I get into it, and then the panic goes away, and then I'm sucked into the book. But I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was not to try to top myself with every book, not to try to make the murders more exciting or, more Each book have something even more exciting than the last. They have to be good. They have to be ones that readers are going to like. But I don't have to continually try to make, figure out, this one has to be better than the last one in this respect. Because then you just end up playing it's a psychological game with yourself, and it is not healthy to do. Just get in there and write a book, love your characters, and the book will come if you love the characters. And I think that was the best piece of advice I ever got. And I have to tell myself that. And I tell my husband to tell me that, because I'm like, I can't do this. It's not coming together. He goes, you always say that. I'll get stuck in the middle. And that's part of my process. I get stuck in the middle of a book and I have veered away from my outline. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I get it back? And the first couple of times it happened, he had to tell me, this has happened before. You figured it out before. So now what I do, and again, this is working backwards thing. I take a pack of, cheapo Post-it notes, and I'll write on the first one, the villain is caught. And for that to happen, this has to happen. And for that to happen, this has to happen. And I back my way in, from the end to where I got stuck, put everything in order, and then I write the rest of the book. So I do that probably 90% of the time.
That's great. You have written some truly scary books. Is there anything that scares you as a writer, as a reader, in life?
I think the scenes I write where close family members are in danger, they tend to scare me. And I remember I was writing one, and this was a book called Silent Scream. And that was it. That one hit a little close to home, because at the very beginning, the first victim is caught in a building that is burned by environmental activists. And they burn this building down thinking it's empty, but there's a teenager in there, and she's deaf, and she can't hear the alarms until it's too late, and she can't get out. And I have a daughter who's deaf. So that hit really close to home for me. And I remember when I was writing that, during the time I was writing it, one of my friends, I get a phone call from her on my cell phone. And when I picked it up, all I could hear was this muffled men's voices in the background. And I'm like, hello, hello, hello. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, she's been kidnapped. And I'm the last call she made. And, so my brain is going all these different directions. I called her cell on my landline, which I still had at the time. And she answers it. Hello. I said, are you all right? Of course I'm all right. And her cat had stepped on her handbag and dialed me. And the man's voices I heard was NPR on the radio. And she goes, this is not one of your books, Karen. This is real life. It's okay. But I do tend to get, especially towards the end of a book, when I'm all caught up in it, the littlest things can cause me to be afraid when it normally wouldn't. And sometimes this is as small as the ice machine going off. And, I'm working, it's the middle of the night, it's dead quiet, and the ice machine drops a load of ice into the bucket. It scares the living daylights out of me.
I completely understand. I was reading another author late at night, like 10 o'clock in the kitchen. The house was dark, and it was kind of a ghost story. And I could swear I could see this white ghostly thing in the corner of my eye drifting past. Freaked me out until I realized the air conditioning had turned on and it was blowing the blinds by the Arcadia doors. But you do have that.
Cool that author puts you in that frame of mind. That's cool.
I was just thinking, okay, how do I get out of the house? And I realized it's okay. Speaking of books we love to read or are scared to read, have you been reading anything recently that you'd like to share?
Well, I'm writing right now, but I am reading, and I make sure I get the exact title. It's called, it is called Alone, Under and Alone. And it's a memoir of a guy who is an ATF agent who went undercover with the Mongols motorcycle club back in the 90s. And he was so far under, he actually became a fully patched member. So this is about, the things he had to do while he was undercover. And I'm just kind of find that fascinating.
As a reader, do you gravitate towards suspense and romance, or do you read completely outside?
Well, I gravitate towards romance, and I think there's always a suspenseful element to it. Like there's a bad guy to be, to be defeated. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't call them classical suspense always. because I do tend to kind of stray away. I like a lot of comedy. I love vampire and werewolf stories, but they typically have an element of suspense in them. They're usually fighting against the big bad. It may not be a serial killer, but it's somebody who wants to harm them. And so, yeah, I do tend to stay within the romance umbrella, unless I'm reading something nonfiction for research. But yeah, I to me, the romances give me that I know everything's going to be okay in the end. And I can actually enjoy the process of reading it without worrying, is everything going to be okay in the end?
I think we should probably take some questions from your fans coming through Facebook. It looks like the first question is, how involved are you in titling your books and the book jackets? And I would add, whoever came up with your recent trilogy, The Say Things, was a genius.
Well, that was me. The Say You're Sorry, Say No More, that I came up with the titles. The covers are just fantastic on this series. I mean, when I opened the first one, Say You're Sorry, when I opened the first one, I remember going, because it was so gorgeous, and they've kind of kept on that, on that theme. I love the detail with the way the model's hair is kind of threaded through the lettering, and it's just all very beautiful. And then they kept up with that with Say Goodbye. And this woman, whoever she is, she looks just like the heroine in my head. So to me, that was really great. Covers, I might tell them something I don't like. The one time I gave a suggestion, the book did really poorly, and they had to redo the cover. I'm like, okay, that's definitely clearly not my forte. I'll back away. But I think I probably come up with the titles maybe 75% of the time. And then sometimes it's like a group idea. Like I'll get a lot of brainstorming from my writing group or some friends, and we'll sit down and come up with a bunch of titles. And the editorial group will say, I like that one, I like that one, I don't like that one. And then we go from there.
Great. Another question is, which is harder for you to write, the opening sentence to a book or the ending sentence?
Oh, the opening sentence, much harder. I might spend 2 months on the first 3 chapters of a book. And then once I've done that and I've kind of set it all up in my head, the rest just, they comes like water. I mean, like water flowing from a river. It just flows.
The next question is, how has social media like Facebook, I guess, Instagram, things like that, influenced you as a writer, or has it not?
I think it's just more contact with readers and, and other people and me as a reader to other readers, like talking about the books that we love. I think that social media has, in some way, it's a time suck. I'm procrastinating writing. I've been on social media a lot today. It might be a day in my life. But I think it also provides us with the ability to reach out to people that we didn't have before. And we were talking before we got started about remembering, back the days when, before there was internet, you sat in a room and you wrote, and you might see people in person, but there wasn't that opportunity to reach out and form connections with people like there is now. So I think that used well, just like anything, when used well, it's really beneficial. And one of the things I started during the pandemic was a monthly Facebook Live. And I think that's one of the things I've started that and learning French on Duolingo. I think I'm going to keep up with those 2 things. But just the opportunity, it's not the same as face-to-face. It's not the same as being able to shake, touch someone's hand or see them in person, to even see their faces. A lot of times when Facebook Live is me and my assistant on the screen. I mean, I know people are out there, but I can't see them. And I would love to get the day when we can get back to doing that. But, it's given us an outlet. It's given us a way to connect. And I'm grateful for that.
Another question is, were you always a reader, especially when you were a child?
I was the little girl who had the flashlight under the covers reading Nancy Drew, or Trixie Belden. That was another series I really liked of a child detective group. I stopped reading when I was in college because I was just busy. I was working, I was going to school. There's textbooks all the time. And it wasn't until I left college And I started traveling. And this was before I was traveling internationally. This was just domestic travel. But I don't like to fly. I still don't like to fly, but I was really afraid of it back then. And we were talking, maybe the late 80s. And some very, he was a very snippish kind of a man I was sitting next to on the plane, but to be fair, I was chatting with him and he did not want to chat. He said, "Lady, go buy a book." And then I realized I didn't remember what I liked to read. I was, probably mid-20s at the time. And so I went to the library and I almost had a mini panic attack because there were so many books. What if I pick the wrong one and then I have to talk to the person on the airplane next to me again? And it was when I read mysteries and comedy and, I read all kinds of things, Westerns. And when I read romance, that's when I realized that was the kind of story that was going to suck me in and make me forget I was on a plane. And then we touched down and I was like, oh, 3 hours have passed and I haven't been worried. So, and I would always carry a book with me on airplanes. So that's kind of, yeah. So I've been just an avid reader ever since. So when I was a kid, up through high school, college was kind of a desert zone. And then I started reading again after.
Are you the kind of reader who, once they start a book, must finish it? Or if a book doesn't hook you, can you let it go?
Oh, my husband watches a lot of movies and I always chide him because he's like, "Oh, this is horrible." I'm like, "You don't have to watch the end of it." But I have a hard time putting a book away. I really do, unless it's made me really angry. And I can't even remember the last book I didn't finish, even if it's just going to the end and reading the last couple chapters so I could see how it ends. I really have trouble saying no to a book. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I usually try to give every chance I can. And when I can't do it anymore, I'll just go to and read the last few chapters.
Do you also enjoy watching scary television shows and scary movies? No?
Never. I'm a wuss. I told this to somebody, they were like, "You're a fraud." I don't watch scary movies because they're scary. They give me bad dreams. I would rather give you all bad dreams. Thank you very much. So, I was in a movie. I went to watch a movie and it was like a Marvel kind of a movie, and it had, and this was years and years ago before Marvel was regenerated, but it was a scary movie with Sally Fields and Kiefer Sutherland, and he had stolen her daughter. And it was just the trailer. And that trailer gave me nightmares for a week. And it was just a trailer. So I'm like, no. Every now and again, you think you're going to watch a happy movie and it turns into a scary movie. And I feel very betrayed. I got tricked into watching a scary movie. It's like, no, not my cup of. Now, horror is definitely not my thing. I can read a scary book, but I find I have to put it down and walk away because I just get too angsty and too tied up in what's going to happen in the end. So I have to put it down, walk away, and I can't go back and finish it.
For someone who's just starting out as a writer, what advice would you give them?
So my advice now, I think it's the same advice, but you're going to have to do it differently. But when I first started writing, I had the benefit of writing because it was fun. I wrote as a hobby because I didn't have any books to read and I was in a hotel room all alone. And I never expected anyone to read it. And I think that gave me a lot of flexibility and a lot of opportunity to try new things that I might not have otherwise tried, because it was just for me. Nobody was going to read it. It was just, I met these people in this book and I really liked them and I wanted to see what they were going to do next. And it was fun. And it made me come, every time I had like a spare moment, I was in there writing and seeing what they were going to do next. I think a lot of times new writers will write to get published and they forget to write because it's fun. And they forget to write because they love characters and because it always comes back to the characters, seeing what they're going to do next, being fascinated with your characters and falling in love with them, or even being afraid of them if they're a villain. I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is don't write to get published. Write because you love the characters that are in your head and you can't wait to see what they do next. The publishing will come, and there's so many ways to do it now that we didn't have back in 1999 when I first started started on this journey. And the the fact that there are so many ways to get published, I think it makes newer authors jump the gun a little bit. They don't take the time to kind of hone their craft and figuring out what, we always talk about voice, but it's an important thing, finding out what your voice is and how you're going to write, what is your niche, how are you going to do that? And then they rush to get published. And then they're kind of in a grind zone where they're going to do the same thing over and over again without having figured out how to do it better, at least the first time through. So don't write to get published, write because you love it.
How would you describe your own writing voice to someone who's never read you?
I think it's dark, but I think there's also a lot of love between the good characters and that sense of community and sense of family. So I think my voice is, yes, there's dark stuff in the world, but if you surround yourself with good people and community and, and the family you make, if it's not the family you were born into, then that's the way you're going to defeat the dark. So I think my voice it's dark, but I think that there's also some light in there as well. And finding that balance is sometimes hard to do.
Do you have a typical writing day?
No, I wish I did. I mean, I have friends that they start at 9 a.m, they finish up at 4 p.m, and they're banging the words out, and it's great. I think at night, and I don't know. Honestly, I wish somebody could hit me in the head with a mallet and change this, but my brain doesn't kick on until about 10 p.m. So my most fruitful hours are between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. And then I'll toddle off to bed and wake up and do it again the next day. But a typical day is usually writing all night, getting my 8 hours of sleep, waking up, doing all the business stuff that needs to be done, and then sitting down to write again. And if I sit down early in the morning and try to write, I just find myself in the same place at 10 o'clock at night. So I've just started, we'll just go with it. Find out you find out what works for you.
Another question is, do you find knitting to help you creatively as a writer?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes and I mentioned it earlier that time that I was stuck on that ski lift when it was quiet helped me figure out how to write that book. It's those quiet moments. And your hands, I've learned that like knitting or doing a craft, it gives your hands something to do, and it occupies the part of your brain that likes to be the hamster in the wheel. And it leaves the other part, oh, okay, I could do that. So yeah, I think it does. I didn't start knitting. I knitted when I was in college, but I didn't start knitting again until, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it was because my ADD was getting really bad. And I started knitting, and it helped quiet that part of that hamster in the wheel. If you've got ADD and you know what I'm talking about, that hamster in the wheel that just goes. And it's so counterproductive to getting anything good done. And if I can quiet that, then I can think oh yeah, that's what has to happen next to the book. Okay. So yes, it does.
This is an interesting question. What book do you wish you had written that was written by somebody else?
Oh, I've been asked this one before, and it's usually going to be a Nalini Singh book because I love her stories. I love the way she writes. There's one that she's written, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's Dev and Katja are the two characters. And in the end, I mean, every time I've read that book, I'm just like crying buckets because she just draws you in so beautifully. And you care so much about the characters. Clearly she's going to pull it out in the end. But I don't even think about that. I'm just so, sucked into the world that she's built and caring about these characters. And I told her once that she made me cry with that book, and she was quite pleased, actually. So.
Well, I haven't seen this question before, but it's interesting. What book would people be surprised to find in your bookshelf at home?
Well, I think, see that where I am here, the books are not all mine. We bought the contents of the bookshelves from the lady we bought the house from.
Oh.
And because she just left her books here. And I said, yeah, I'll go through them at some point and give them away. But for the beginning of the pandemic, nobody was taking donations,
Mhm.
because of, whatever. But so I just kind of let them go. But there's Nietzsche, and she was quite an avid reader. So there's Nietzsche on my bookshelf. There's a vegan cookbook, and I actually do my own bookshelves. I have a couple cookbooks, and I've never actually used them. So I think people who know me would be really surprised to find a cookbook on my shelf, because I'm no cook. Microwave cooking, to me, the hard part is, reading and like, oh, I have to cook it for 5 minutes and then stir it. That's hard.
I think we have time for one last question, and that's what's next for you as an author?
Well, I've finished up the Sacramento series with Say Goodbye. I will be coming back to Sacramento because there's a couple characters whose stories yet I have not told. But I have started a new series, and it's set in New Orleans, and it's a group of private detectives, and it's been a lot of fun, an awful lot of fun.
And is that coming in like the end of the year? Do we have any idea of or is it
Probably
still
next summer? Next summer, I think. And there are characters from Say No More that will cross over into, because Mercy in Say No More, she had been living in New Orleans for college and then beyond. And so some of the people that she knew that come into the Sacramento books I've gone back to New Orleans and appear in those books.
That's great. Well, I can't believe our time has just flown right by. This is The Poison Pen. We've been delighted to have with us today Karen Rose, New York Times bestselling author, whose latest book is Say Goodbye. We do have signed copies. We have Karen's other books in stock if you'd like to order them. I want to thank Karen for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Say congratulations on your 25th book, and let's hope for 25 more.
Thank you. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank all the readers, because, when I wrote that first book back in 2000, and it is published in 2003, I never dreamed. I never even knew to dream that I could be where I am now 25 books later. So thank you so very much.
Okay, do I still have Karen?
You do.
Okay, I think I successfully ended Facebook. And in case I lose you as I close things out, thank you again, Karen. It's been delightful. You're just a wonderful author and a great speaker. I enjoyed hearing your replies to the questions and things.
Thank you. Thank you. And I hope that I can see you in person again in the near future.
We'll cross our fingers and hope that comes about. We would love to have you come back to the bookstore, either virtually or in person, whatever suits the times. But thank you again. It was delightful to see you, and please stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.